Devon LARRATT has a super match coming up in less than 3 weeks against Leonidas Arcona at King of the Table. Lately, Devon has put out some very interesting training footage that is not the kind of training we normally see from him. Today, we're going to analyze this footage. So something that Devon has done for quite some time now is he's done a lot of super specific arm wrestling training. But what we're going to see here is not the kind of arm wrestling specific training that he normally does. We see Devon going up against someone using two hands. And this is potentially arm wrestling specific. It's obviously on the table. But when Devon talks about arm wrestling specific, one of the things that he wants to do is he actually wants to do lifts that are below his 1 rep max. He doesn't want to fail a lift, but he wants to complete it. So when he talks about arm wrestling specific, it is specific to actually pinning your opponent or to getting a win. And this is why we saw him doing those pronation lifts, the supination lifts, the rise lifts, all throughout the day over and over again, because he was doing a weight that he could complete. So he was simulating the start of the match and then just barely cracking back his opponent's wrist or barely taking heights, but he wasn't ever failing. He was always doing a weight that he was comfortable enough to lift. So this kind of training we see here from Devon is very interesting because you'll notice he is not moving his opponents and he's actually ripping through his own pronator. He's ripping through his own bicep angle. Now, we have seen Devon do this kind of thing before for more of a promo thing or just for fun, but this seems to be something Devon is intentionally doing, that he's seeking out as an actual form of training. It seems like he's adding this maybe specifically for Leonidas, or he's just figured out that this is a good training method in general. So it's very interesting to see Devon going beyond failure, doing a forced eccentric rep, essentially ripping through his own arm, ripping through his own pronation. Now let's talk about the way in which he is setting this up, because there's a lot of ways to arm wrestle an opponent with two hands. This is only one of those ways, and the way that they're doing this, it's hugely emphasizing putting way more force on Devon's pronation. There's still a lot of force on Devon's arm, obviously, but you can see that Devon's opponent is wrapping his hand around Devon's arm. So a lot of people would tend to put their elbow on the pad and they would take this left arm and actually go underneath the opponent's arm, just in the same way that the right arm is going underneath. And this would make it a lot easier for Devon to go ahead and top roll that opponent, and potentially that would just be emphasizing his arm power. It wouldn't really be increasing his ability to block Devon's pronation that much. But because of the fact that he has his elbow in the air and he's going around Devon's arm like that, you can see him going around Devon's pronator. It looks very similar to the way that you would wrap a pronation lift. Now Devon's opponent has a huge mechanical advantage to attack Devon's pronator, and there is just no way that Devon is going to be able to top roll this opponent. He's going to get his pronator ripped open if he tries to drive to the side. If you guys have ever tried to arm wrestle someone with two hands before using this exact setup, you know that all of a sudden it feels like you just have no pronation. There's no possible way to top roll an opponent who is using this setup because of the mechanical advantage they have to attack your pronator. Potentially you could beat someone in a hook like this, but this is very humbling if you're trying to train your pronator against much weaker opponents, against much weaker sparring partners. This could be something to look into. But we see Devon hitting, we see him just slightly ripping through his own pronator, slightly ripping through his own bicep, so he doesn't have a super full range of motion. And we also see his opponent allowing him to get quite a bit of work in. So this isn't a 1 rep max kind of thing. His opponent is obviously not trying to win here, but Devon is still getting a huge amount of work in here, specifically on that pronator. So Devon is basically simulating going up against an opponent who doesn't necessarily have the strongest arm in the world, but their wrist flexion is just out of this world. They have the strongest cup, the strongest wrist in the world, and their arm is maybe kind of average. So it's a very interesting pressure that Devon would be feeling right here. And this is just going to make it completely impossible. If he can absorb this stimulus, this is going to make it really, really difficult for any of his opponents to be able to cup him, because mechanically, this is just way more cupping pressure than any normal human could ever apply. And we see Devon continuing this style of training with other people. So it's not like he was just doing this as a one-off thing just for fun, just for a bit. It seems like this is actually something being incorporated into his training. You can see his opponent now even grabbing onto that top strap, just giving himself more leverage to attack Devon's pronator. It's going to be completely impossible for Devon to top roll here, but he's getting a huge amount of force on his pronator and really in that kind of open top roll king's move lane that Devon tends to pull in a lot, where he kind of has partially lost his pronation already. So this is potentially an extremely effective, extremely specific stimulus for what Devon's trying to train here. So I think that the table specificity of this is very cool. However, there are some obvious limitations to this style of training, and those obvious limitations are the very reason that Devon historically hasn't done this kind of training. And it's because, firstly, you're going to be going beyond failure. So potentially your ability to train more often and make more total gains and get more total volume in is going to be limited. You're also probably at a much higher risk of injury doing something like this. But maybe even more importantly is that it's extremely difficult to measure what you're even doing. If you're doing a pronation single like Devon has done in the past, it's super easy to know exactly how strong you are as long as you keep your form perfect. You simply add a pound and you know for certain that you're 1 pound stronger in that lift. But with this style of two-handed training, there's a million different factors that are all going to play into how difficult this is for Devon. And one of those is how hard his opponent is even trying. Because if his opponent is trying a little bit less hard or a little bit more hard, that's going to hugely affect Devon's ability to roll out here. If he grips slightly differently, that's going to change how it feels. So this may be a really good stimulus, but it's going to be nearly impossible for Devon to figure out if he's getting stronger or not. There's no realistic way for him to measure his progress here. Now, one last thing that I wanted to mention, and I think this is super cool, and probably a lot of you guys are already thinking about this, but John Brzenk also used to train in this way where he would go up against someone with two hands. Obviously, this is before John used to ever do any kind of weight training, and no one at his practice was strong enough to give him the kind of stimulus he needed in order to get stronger. He was obviously just going to kill everybody at his own practice, and I believe this was back when he was training with Bob Brown. So what would happen is Bob Brown would use two hands versus John Brzenk's one hand, and then he would go until he thought he was capable of defeating John with one hand once he had gassed John out significantly, and then he would try to switch to one hand and try to beat John with one hand from that point on. So I think this is kind of similar to what Devon is doing, but it's super interesting to see how things can come full circle and how a training method that was used decades ago can still be very prevalent. So let me know what you guys think about this training. I think it's super interesting in general, and I think it's super interesting that Devon is just now starting to implement this seemingly for the first time in a lot of years. I think there's a huge amount of potential to apply a very sport-specific stimulus to that pronator muscle and to that elbow flexor and make yourself just about impossible to cup. However, as I said, the obvious drawback is the measurability of your progress. But I'll look forward to see how this is going to affect Devon on the table, how effective this kind of training is going to be in his next match.